America just threw the biggest birthday party in a generation. The fireworks were bigger than usual. Tall ships sailed back into the old harbors, and in every town square, one date hung on the banners: July 4th, 2026, the country's 250th birthday. But here's a strange thing. When pollsters asked, nearly half of Americans couldn't say exactly what the 4th of July commemorates. And the real answer is stranger than the fireworks let on, because the road to that July morning in 1776 ran through a war that was already a year old, a massacre in the streets of Boston, and a date most of us get slightly wrong. Independence wasn't declared on the 4th. It wasn't even voted on the 4th. To understand how 13 quarreling colonies became one nation and why we celebrate the date we do, you have to go back more than a decade to a war that had nothing to do with independence at all. So, let's rewind. The year is 1763, and Britain has just won one of the largest wars in its history. In North America, they called it the French and Indian War, the fight that pushed France off most of the continent and left Britain in control of a vast new empire, from Canada down to Florida. The colonists had fought alongside British regulars. They were proud subjects of the crown, and there was no serious talk of revolution anywhere. There was just one problem. Winning had been staggeringly expensive. That war had nearly doubled Britain's national debt to something like £140 million, an almost unimaginable sum at the time. And Britain still had to defend all that new territory, with troops stationed across the colonies. So the government in London looked across the Atlantic and reached a simple conclusion. The colonies had gained the most from the war, so the colonies should help pay for it. That decision, not yet a tax, just a decision, is where the real road to July 4th begins. The first attempt came in 1764 with something called the Sugar Act. And here's the part people get backwards. It didn't raise the tax on molasses, it cut it, roughly in half. But it did something new. For the first time, Britain enforced the tax seriously, hunting down smugglers and trying them in special courts with no jury. The message was clear. London was going to collect. It was the first law openly designed to raise revenue from the colonies. But it was the next one that lit the fuse. In March of 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, and this one touched everyone. It required an official stamp, a tax, on virtually every piece of paper in colonial life. Newspapers, contracts, licenses, pamphlets, even playing cards and dice. A lawyer, a printer, a merchant, a man playing cards in a tavern, all of them suddenly paid. And the reaction was volcanic. Not really because of the cost, which was fairly modest. It was the principle. For the first time, London was reaching directly inside the colonies to tax them. And the colonists had no members in Parliament, no vote, and no say in it at all. Out of that anger came a phrase you still hear today: no taxation without representation. Now, the British had an answer for it. They argued that every member of Parliament represented every British subject everywhere, something they called virtual representation, whether you had actually voted for them or not. The colonists simply didn't accept it. Their objection wasn't really about the money, it was about consent. And in October 1765, they did something they had never done before. 27 delegates from 9 colonies met in New York as the Stamp Act Congress, the first time the separate colonies acted together as one. The boycotts worked. In March 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, and the colonies celebrated. But on the very same day, Parliament passed another law, the Declaratory Act, quietly asserting its right to bind the colonies, in its own words, in all cases whatsoever. The retreat was really a warning, and a year later, Britain proved it meant those words. The Townshend Acts of 1767 placed new duties on imported glass, paint, paper, and tea, and used the money to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, putting them beyond the colonists' control. The boycotts flared up again, and most of those duties were repealed in 1770, but Britain deliberately kept one of them: the tax on tea. All of this friction concentrated in one city, Boston. British troops were now stationed there to keep order, and the resentment was constant. Soldiers and locals trading insults in the streets. On the night of March 5, 1770, a crowd gathered around a lone British sentry, taunting him, throwing snowballs, ice, and worse. More soldiers came to his aid. In the chaos and the shouting, shots were fired into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed, among them a sailor named Crispus Attucks, and 6 more were wounded. Word spread fast, and it spread furious. They called it the Boston Massacre. But here's the moment that tells you these were not yet revolutionaries. When those British soldiers were put on trial, the lawyer who agreed to defend them was John Adams, a Boston patriot and a future president of the United States. Adams believed the rule of law mattered more than the fury of the mob, and he won acquittals for the captain and most of his men. Think about what that means. The colonists were enraged by the massacre, but they still wanted British justice, not a break from Britain. Independence was not yet the goal. That would take one more provocation. For a couple of years, things cooled. Then, in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. On its face, it actually made tea cheaper. But it handed a single struggling British corporation, the East India Company, a monopoly on selling tea in America. And crucially, it kept that one leftover tax in place: the tea duty from the Townshend years. So the cheaper tea still carried the very tax the colonists had sworn never to pay. To many of them, it didn't look like a bargain. It looked like a trap, a bribe to make them swallow the principle they'd been fighting over for 8 years. On the night of December 16, 1773, they refused to swallow it. Roughly 150 men, many of them sons of liberty, some loosely disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships tied up in Boston Harbor: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Over about 3 hours, working in near silence, they split open 342 chests of East India Company tea and dumped every last one into the water. No one was hurt. Nothing else was stolen or burned. It was precise, disciplined, and unmistakable, a deliberate act of defiance. History would call it the Boston Tea Party. Britain was finished being patient. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws meant to punish Massachusetts and make an example of it. They shut the port of Boston completely until the ruined tea was paid for. They tore up much of Massachusetts's self-government, putting power in the hands of the Crown. In America, people gave these laws a name that stuck: the Intolerable Acts. But that name was the colonists' own, a piece of brilliant protest branding. In Britain, they were simply the Coercive Acts. The whole point, right there in the name, was to coerce one rebellious colony back into line. It backfired completely. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the punishment frightened every other colony, because if London could do this to Boston, it could do it to any of them. In September 1774, 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They agreed to stand together and cut off nearly all trade with Britain until the laws were repealed. The colonies were no longer 13 separate places minding their own affairs. They were beginning to act like one. And then, before anyone had declared anything, the shooting started. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched out of Boston to seize weapons and gunpowder the colonists had stockpiled in the town of Concord. Local militia, the Minutemen, were waiting. On Lexington's village green, in the gray morning light, a single shot rang out. To this day, no one knows which side fired first. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead. By the end of that day, the British were retreating back to Boston under fire the whole way. It became known as the shot heard round the world. And here is the fact almost everyone misses. This was April 1775. The War for Independence had already begun, more than a year before independence was ever declared. Now the colonies had a war on their hands, but not yet a nation. When the Second Continental Congress met in May 1775, it became a government almost by accident. It created a Continental Army and put a Virginia planter named George Washington in command. And yet, even then, most delegates still hoped to patch things up with Britain. What finally changed their minds wasn't a battle, it was a pamphlet. In January 1776, a recent immigrant named Thomas Paine published Common Sense anonymously. And in plain, blazing language, it argued that it was simply absurd for an entire continent to be ruled by a distant island. It sold more than 100,000 copies within months. Almost overnight, independence stopped being unthinkable. It started to sound like common sense. And so, we arrive at the summer of 1776. On June 7th, a Virginia delegate named Richard Henry Lee rose in Congress and moved that the colonies ought to be free and independent states. The delegates debated it for weeks, and then, on July 2nd, 1776, they voted, 12 colonies in favor, New York holding back, to break from Britain, July the 2nd. That was the day independence was actually chosen. John Adams was so sure of it that he wrote home to his wife Abigail that the 2nd day of July would be celebrated by future generations forever with parades and fireworks. He had exactly the right idea and the wrong date, because Congress still had to approve the document explaining why. That text, drafted by a committee with Thomas Jefferson holding the pen, was adopted 2 days later on July 4th, 1776. That is the date printed across the top of the page. That is the date we kept. And the famous signing, all those signatures on the great parchment? Most of them weren't added until August 2nd, a full month after the vote, which brings us back to the fireworks. When America marked its 250th birthday on July 4th, 2026, it wasn't really celebrating a birthday at all. No nation was born in a single day. What happened on that date was quieter and, honestly, bigger. A people who were already at war, who had spent 13 years being taxed, occupied, and pushed, finally wrote down, in plain words, the decision they had already made with their lives. That's the whole chain. A war Britain won in 1763 left a mountain of debt. The debt brought taxes. The taxes brought resistance. Resistance brought soldiers, and soldiers brought blood. Blood brought a boycott, a Congress, and a battle. And only then, at the very end of all of it, a declaration. July 4th isn't the beginning of the story. It's the moment the story finally got its name. So this year, when you watch the sky light up, you'll know what you're really marking. Not a document, a decision, 13 years in the making. And 2.5 centuries on, the questions those colonists argued over, who gets a say, and who has to give their consent to be governed, are still the questions a democracy has to answer. again and again. If you like seeing how one decision quietly leads to the next, all the way down to the world you live in, subscribe, and we'll trace what led here next.